Hello, gentlemen. As I said on Friday, you're going to be listening to this recorded lecture. This is following our simulated natural selection activity or lab, for which you'll be writing a lab report. And after you listen to this lecture, you'll be filling out the Google form that I shared with you on the other day. First of all, I apologize. I'm a little stuffy, a little sick, so I hope I'm not incomprehensible. But today's lecture is all about formalizing an understanding of natural selection. Now, we've talked a lot about variation. Okay, in our variation lab, we talked about discrete and quantitative variation. We talked about sources of variation as well. I want us, as we listen to this lecture, I want you to think about two things. Number one, I want you to reflect on how our activity on Friday, our natural selection simulated activity, how that applies, or rather how natural selection applies to our activity. All right. And secondly, I want you to reflect on the fact that variation itself, or how variation acts as a driving force for natural selection. We came to some good understandings, preliminary understandings, about why variation is important. We talked about durability and ability to withstand environmental changes. Variation is an important part of natural selection. In fact, like I said, it is a driving force. I want you to continue to reflect on those two things as we listen to our lecture today. Now, before we actually formalize our understanding about natural selection, I think it's always a useful analogy to make comparing a natural selection to the game of musical chairs. And so in your Google form, I'm going to ask you a question that you see below. Here's a question. In musical chairs, why is one person always kicked out of the game? Now, hopefully we were familiar with musical chairs, and I want you to think about it for a second. Why somebody's always kicked out of the game every round. I'm going to pause for a second to let you think. Okay, I hope you've thought a little bit about the game of musical chairs, and hopefully you've come to the conclusion, and it's a pretty obvious conclusion, but one person's always kicked out of the game of musical chairs because there's always, in every round, one fewer chair than there are participants. All right, that means because there's one fewer chair, certainly everybody that's playing the game is competing over what we're going to call limited resources. The resources that we're talking about, of course, are chairs. Okay? And so the people playing musical chairs are always competing over something that there's not enough of. All right? And if you're not able to acquire a chair or acquire resources, you're kicked out of the game. Now, in many ways, natural selection works just like this. People or organisms, whatever organism you are competing. They're always competing over resources, but those resources are never enough to provide for all of the organisms. There's always a limited supply of resources. Now, those resources can be many kinds of things. They can be food resources, and any kind of food resources that we're talking about. It can be territorial or land or area resources. Those resources can be sexual mates. There are always a limited number of those. Resources can be survivability from predators. Right? There's only a limited number of organisms that can survive attacks from predators. Now, so resources are very abundant, or rather, the limited resources, the examples are very abundant, and we can keep thinking about how resources are limited. All right, so if resources are limited, or there are always limited resources, you have to now ask yourself the question and answer this on your Google Doc. What happens to a variable population, or a population that shows variety or variation? What happens to this variable population when there are limited resources like food or space? Now you can see in this image that we've got a variable population. The population doesn't demonstrate extraordinary variation, but it does demonstrate variation. Most obvious, of course, is some ladybugs are colored into a red-orange kind of color with two black dots on their back. And other ladybugs are inverted. They've got a black sort of shell or casing with red dots, and 4 red dots instead of 2. Okay, now this is a very superficial form of variation, and we know that variation comes in quantitative and discrete varieties. But ask yourself and answer the question on your Google Doc, what happens to a variable population when there are limited resources like food or space? I'm going to pause and give you some time to think and answer that question. Okay, so hopefully you've paused, answered that question, and we can come to some understanding here that when there are limited resources, some organisms will be able to acquire them. And just like our game of musical chairs, some organisms will be kicked out of the game because they can't acquire those resources. They can't acquire those resources that are limited. Right? Now, of course, there is no such thing as a game. Being kicked out of the game is just another way of saying either dying or not being able to pass down genes or to the next generation, which is to say not having offspring or not having enough or as many offspring. So, in a variable population with limited resources, some organisms can compete well, other organisms can't compete well. And now this has to do in some ways with how suited certain organisms are to the environment, and if the environment changes, who now is best suited for the environment. Let's take a look at those, what we can call suitabilities. The image that we see here on this page is an image of a number of different species of finches. Now, if we're familiar at all with Darwin and Darwin's story, when he arrived at the Galapagos Islands, he experienced a number of different finches, and each finch sometimes was located and localized on a given island, or he found that only certain islands possessed certain finches, and each finch was unique. And in this image you see the uniqueness comes from the shape of each finch's beak. And Darwin concluded, as well as many researchers, specifically Rosemary and Peter Grant on the Galapagos Islands today, they conclude that the shape of an organism's beak, or the shape of these finches' beaks, has something to do, in many ways has a lot to do, with the kinds of food resources these finches try to acquire. Now you can see that some finches try to eat insects or nectar. So these finches eat nectar. Here's another nectar feeder. This finch eats seeds and tries to crush those seeds. You can see this finch uses its beak almost as a knife or a can opener to pry open bark. So you can see the finches do lots of different things with differently shaped beaks. Now I want you to ask yourself, which bird is best suited if the only food source available, and that limited food source is available, is seeds? All right, take a look and see if you can answer that question. All right, so if you've taken a look at these finches, I think it's pretty easy to recognize, considering it is made explicit with the explanations, that the Nahoa finch is best suited to eat seeds. And you can ask yourself, well, why is that? Well, in many ways, the shape of the beak and the way the beak is constructed, the beak's structure, facilitates it eating seeds better than the other finches. You can see that certainly this finch's beak is big. It looks like it's relatively strong. It can be used to crush things and to smash things. Certainly that beak is not good at getting nectar inside a flower, like the iwi finch or the amakihi finch, which are long and pointed and can be inserted into a flower to extract the nectar. The Nahoa finch is not well suited for nectar, but it is really well suited for seeds. And so if the resources that were available but limited, the only ones were seeds, and then the Nahoa finch would be best suited to acquire those resources. It would be, in this game of musical chairs, the winner of the game. So we've talked about suitability in the face of limited resources. This suitability can also be described as a word known as adaptation. In evolution, and in the understanding of evolution by natural selection, the word adaptation means a feature or ability that increases an organism's ability to compete for resources. Now, in our everyday understanding of adaptation, it means something slightly different, and let's be careful to use this word properly in our discussions of natural selection. Adaptation does not mean changing yourself or your abilities over your lifetime. In evolution and in a discussion of natural selection, adaptations are fixed to some degree, or they're inherited to some degree. So a single organism is not adapting to its environment. It possesses adaptations, and some of those adaptations are better suited to the environment, and other adaptations are not well suited to that environment. Okay, so again, adaptations are relatively fixed, and they are not changing. Another important word that is related to adaptations is a term known as reproductive fitness. When we say reproductive fitness, or when we just say evolutionary fitness, or we can maybe just call it fitness, the organisms that are best fit to an environment are those ones that have the best ability to pass genes to the next generation. That means that this organism is living long enough to live to a reproductively mature age. And it also means that the organism is living long enough, but also attracting enough mates to actually produce those offspring. So an organism that is very reproductively fit has lots of offspring and is passing many of its genes to the next generation. And we can understand then that an organism that is well suited to an environment is competing well for resources. That means it's well adapted. And if it's acquiring resources, it's likely surviving and having offspring. So let's come up with a definition, a comprehensive definition for natural selection. Here is our comprehensive definition for natural selection using the two previous definitions that we established. Natural selection is the process that predicts that those individuals which show more adaptive features or traits will increase their reproductive fitness. In other words, those organisms that can best compete for resources, whatever those resources may be, will best be able to survive, reproduce, and pass their genes on to the next generation. So here we see an example of something where we can say a selective pressure is occurring. The selective pressure, the thing that's forcing natural selection's hand, is a predator. Okay, so this predator is a selective pressure on these beetles. Okay, let me write that. It's a selective pressure because it's let's say it's unveiling the certain adaptations that are at hand, and it is unveiling the organisms that have highest reproductive fitness. And so those organisms that have highest reproductive fitness will best be able to survive and reproduce, therefore passing down their genes. Now ask yourself, which organisms are best able to survive and reproduce? Well, certainly, or the other question we can ask is, what resource are they competing for? Well, certainly they're competing for the ability to survive, or they're competing for survivability. And those organisms best able to survive are the ones that are what we say cryptically colored or camouflaged. The ones that are best camouflaged are these brownish beetles, all right, and they will have a better ability to survive and reproduce. That doesn't mean that every single brown beetle will survive and reproduce. Some brown beetles will be captured, some brown beetles won't reproduce for whatever reason. And that's not to say that every green beetle will be eaten. Some green beetles will be able to survive and reproduce. But on average, by and large, the brown beetles compete better for survivability than the green beetles, which is to say the brown beetle's genes become more popular the next generation, and the green beetle's genes become less popular. All right, so the brown beetles are selected for, I'll put an up arrow, for increasing popularity in the next generation, and the green beetles will be selected against. We'll put a downwards arrow to represent decreased survivability. And so when we talk about evolution by natural selection, we can have a somewhat nuanced understanding of it in so many ways that, in many ways, natural selection is just about which traits become more popular in the next and in other future generations. Again, in many ways, it's simply a popularity contest. So ask yourself, which organism's genes will become more popular next generation? Certainly those ones that are surviving and reproducing best will become more popular. And so as we look, or as we can predict in future populations, those organisms that have the best adaptations, or the ones that are selected for, will be able to increase their genetic popularity. All right, so I've just drawn on this page a simple normal distribution, or a bell curve. All right, this bell curve oftentimes represents a distribution of a single trait, or the variation of a single trait. And as you may recall, this variation is a quantitative variation, meaning that there is a continuum, there is a range for this variation. And most organisms occupy the middle range. That is to say, this middle range is most popular. So in this given environment, you can look at this graph and understand that in the middle, right, or the average of this one trait is the most adaptive feature, or imbues the highest reproductive fitness, because there are the most individuals, or rather that this part of the trait has the highest frequency of individuals. Okay, so we're going to always start with this normal distribution when we talk about which traits become best or more adaptive, or which traits change due to changing environments and changing reproductive fitnesses. We're using this graph because most traits exist along a continuum. So if we're looking at any given trait, we'll usually find ourselves with a bell curve like this. Okay, so let's move on and see that there are actually a number of different ways that natural selection can act to change a population's features. All right, so what we see here are graphs that represent three distinct kinds of natural selection, which is to say, three distinct paths that evolution may take on a population. Or in other words, three distinct ways in which populations can change. For each of these scenarios, we start with our normal distribution, and as time moves on, we see that future generations exhibit different frequencies of particular traits. All right, again, we're always starting with our normal distribution, or our simple bell curve. And so in this kind of natural selection called stabilizing selection, what we see is within this bell curve, the organisms that have the black dots, those are the ones that are dying. That is to say, they do not exhibit great adaptations, and therefore they do not exhibit great reproductive fitness. They are selected against and out of the population. So we see that the organisms on the extremes are decreasing them in popularity, and the organisms in the middle of this distribution have the highest fitness. Okay, they have the highest reproductive fitness. They are the best ones able to reproduce and survive. And so what you see is, over time, the organisms that demonstrate that middle of that distribution curve increase in popularity, and over time, the organisms on the extremes start decreasing in popularity. We can think of a particular example of this. For example, let's talk about the weight of a newborn human baby. Okay, the weight of a newborn baby can vary widely. You might ask, remember, for example, what weight you were when you were born. Personally, I remember that my mom told me that I was 7 pounds 6 ounces, which is somewhere in this middle range here. Okay. And you can imagine that anything beyond, I don't know, 10 pounds or 12 pounds, that is somewhere along this higher end extreme. And somebody who is 3 pounds, it would be on the other smaller end extreme. Okay, and we can imagine that both the 10-pound baby is going to decrease its survivability because it's going to be very difficult, physiologically speaking, to birth that baby. That baby might be too big to pass through any kind of birth canal. It might offer complications, decreasing both the baby's and the mother's survivability. And a baby that's born too light, at 3 pounds, is likely born premature, probably is not well developed enough, and therefore its survivability or its fitness is decreased as well. So what we find here is that there is a happy medium. This happy medium has highest fitness and will then begin to persist in future generations. So we find that human babies, exist in a sort of limited or stabilizing kind of manner. We can move on to a different kind of selection in which now it's the extremes, right? The extremes are well adapted or have high fitness. They're selected for. And the middle or the median is selected against and out of the population. Now this one is somewhat difficult to think of, but there are actually many interesting examples here. One example we can think of is, I like to think of this one, is pumpkins in a pumpkin patch. All right, over Halloween, lots of people decide to collect pumpkins, and so they go to their local pumpkin patch, and what they end up doing is they end up selecting for, or rather selecting out of the population of the pumpkin patch, certain pumpkins. So what ends up happening is the pumpkins that end up surviving are the ones that are on the either extreme. The reason for this is true because the general population or the customers tend to find the medium-sized pumpkins. They think the pumpkins that are too big are less attractive, and maybe they're too heavy to carry away from the pumpkin patch. So the ones that are too big will increase in their reproductive fitness, and the ones that are too small are just not attractive, and they don't want to gather a small pumpkin. So those pumpkins are left to continue to reproduce in the pumpkin patch. They increase their fitness. But the pumpkins in the middle, those are the most attractive. They're taken out of the population. They're not allowed to reproduce, and their reproductive fitness goes down. And so what we see is in future generations, as this selection, as this kind of disruptive selection persists, you end up seeing two now almost separate peaks, or two different and separate normal distribution curves. Okay, because the middle populations are so unpopular, or they're so reproductively unfit, that they're always selected out of the population. Now, this is an interesting kind of natural selection because this is a kind of natural selection that will facilitate speciation. So over long periods of time and many generations, these two normal distribution curves, these two frequency curves, might get further and further apart, and this one population now becomes two populations. And if they are isolated from each other for long enough time, they may evolve or change to be new species or separate species. All right, that is a form of disruptive selection. And a form of directional selection is the third kind of natural selection that we'll talk about. A directional selection is a kind of natural selection in which only one end of the normal curve is selected against. All right, and so let's say that the smaller curve, or the smaller end of the spectrum, or the smaller end of the continuum is is unfit for this new environment. Maybe there is a shortage of seeds, but the seeds are all very big. And so only those organisms, or those birds, for example, that have big enough beaks that can crack those big seeds, or those are the ones that will be have a higher fitness. And so the birds that have small beaks will be selected out of the population. They won't have very good abilities to survive and reproduce. They won't reproduce, and their genes won't become popular in the next generation, whereas the birds that do have bigger beaks end up becoming more popular. All right, and as you can see, this curve slowly but surely moves towards the left, suggesting that maybe these birds' beaks, on average, are increasing in size, so that they can better crack these seeds. Again, these are three separate and distinct forms of natural selection. In your Google Doc, I'd like you to come up with examples, at least one more example for each kind of natural selection. So think about instances in which the extremes are unfit and are selected out of the population. Think of an example where the extremes are well fit and are selected for, and the median or the middle is selected out of the population. And think of an example where only one extreme is unfit and the other extreme is highly fit and is selected for and increases in popularity in future generations. All right, you're going to add to those in your Google Docs. So we've defined natural selection, we've defined adaptation, and we've defined reproductive fitness. We've talked about three different kinds of natural selection, or three different sort of behaviors and how natural selection acts on populations and on traits. Now let's talk about the four different criteria necessary for natural selection to happen. This means that these criteria need to be present in order for a population to change or to evolve by natural selection. If any one of these if any one of these four criteria is absent or is not fulfilled, then the population will not change. The population will not evolve. And we're going to talk more about this next week as well. The first criteria for natural selection is that there must be limited resources. And with limited resources comes competition for those resources. Okay. Now we can imagine if if the resources are not limited, then there's not going to be competition because all organisms are able to acquire those resources. And if all organisms can acquire those resources, they'll all be able to survive and reproduce. Okay, so competition for limited resources is a criterion for natural selection to occur. All right, if there are limited resources, we have a population that is competing, well, that population has to be a variable population. There has to be variation in that population. Because if all organisms look the same or behave the same, then they'd all compete equally for those resources, which means that no one kind of organism would be competing better. No one organism would be better suited to acquire those resources. Which brings me to the next criterion, which is out of this variation, some of those traits must be adaptive, which is to say they will imbue the organism with a higher reproductive fitness. Some organisms must be able to better compete for those resources than other organisms. We can imagine that even if the population was variable, but if that variation didn't imbue any kind of adaptive features, then they, again, even though they look different, those organisms, the organisms would still be able, or still be competing equally. And so therefore, no one organism would be better able to survive and reproduce, and its genes would not then be passed on at an increasing rate to the next generation. And finally, the fourth criterion for natural selection is that the traits that are adaptive must be heritable. They must be able to be genetically coded and passed down to the next generation. Because think about it, if a trait is adaptive and it allows that organism to better compete for resources, but it's not coded for in your DNA, then even if you're able to pass down genes more frequently, your offspring won't inherit those genes or won't inherit that adaptive feature, which is to say your offspring would not be better able to compete, and therefore they would not be able to better pass down their genes. All right, and so these four criteria need to work in conjunction with one another. Again, in the absence of any one of these criteria, natural selection will not occur. So your job in your Google Doc is to then pick one condition for natural selection and explain to me or reiterate why natural selection would not occur if this condition were removed. You can do that in your Google Doc. And we've just about finished with our discussion about natural selection. These are a couple questions that I don't believe I've included on the Google Doc, but you can answer for yourself. Number one, how can you tell if a feature is adaptive? And number two, what does this mean for the next generation? And then finally, I believe one of the last questions on your Google Doc that we did not talk about, but what I'd like you to do is to open your text and read about what's known as artificial selection. Okay, I'll write it down. All right, read about artificial selection. And what I'd like you to do is to compare and contrast artificial selection and natural selection, which means find similarities between the two and find differences between the two, and explain them. All right, that's your last task for your Google Doc. If you have any questions about this lecture or about your job that's due on Monday, please email me or let me know in some way. Otherwise, have a great weekend. I'll see you guys on Monday.